And after we finish defeating Iran, which is being very badly defeated, pretty soon I'll be declaring the Hormuz Strait a territory of the United States. Essentially, that's what it is. We have the blockade. No ships get through unless we want them to.
More tough talk all around over this weekend as both Donald Trump and the Iranian regime escalate their rhetoric, if not their actions, surrounding the Strait of Hormuz. I'm Borzu Deragahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. You can find me also at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on YouTube. I might take it a little bit easy these next couple weeks with less podcasts being hosted, maybe a little bit shorter, maybe just posting some interviews in my podcasts that I do with other news outlets. A little bit less content, a little bit less commentary, but I wanted to direct you to my YouTube channel where I have put up some of the interviews and versions of interviews that used to be behind a paywall. So there's some great stuff there, including interviews with Trita Parsi and Nahid Siamdoust on the YouTube channel, which I would strongly recommend that you check out and subscribe to. Donald Trump's little commentary, obviously he was somewhat joking, but that didn't prevent the Iranians from acting like they were taking it seriously, upping the rhetoric about this comment vis-a-vis control over the Strait of Hormuz. This was at a rally on Friday that he attended. He tends to go off script at these rallies, and perhaps to the detriment of U.S. foreign policy. And as you see in this next clip, in which he basically downplays the increasing cost of gasoline in the United States as a result of the war, even on domestic policy ahead of the elections. I'm sure a lot of Republicans looking ahead at midterms this November squirmed as Donald Trump said this.
For you to pay a tiny little bit more for your gasoline, just remember, you're doing it so that a very evil country cannot have a country. Really, it's the number one state sponsor of terror in the world. We don't want to have them have a nuclear weapon. So remember that when you have to pay a little bit more, you're at $4. It's okay. I mean, it's I'll never apologize. I did the right thing.
First of all, gas up at $4 is quite expensive for Americans, where gas is sometimes even below $2 per gallon. The United States, you shouldn't compare it to Europe. First of all, the United States is an major oil producing country. And also the infrastructure in the United States is such that people don't have access to public transportation. They have to have cars. In states like California, Texas, these huge states, if you don't have a car, you don't get to work. You don't get to take your kids to school. They don't have public transportation in these places. And so it's essential that the price of gas stays somewhat low for people to be able to survive. Salaries are not keeping pace with these increasing costs either. So over the weekend, I had several interviews with both NewsX World and a Pakistani television channel. Let me play those interviews for you here, in which I comment on the latest developments, the latest diplomatic developments, and on the statements by Trump about both domestic and international politics. But before we get into those interviews, just a brief commercial. Hi, I'm Borzu Deragahi, host of the Badlands podcast and writer of the Badlands newsletter. You can find me on Spotify. You can find me on YouTube. You can find me on Apple Podcasts. You can also find me on Substack. That's where I'm usually at Borzu, BORZOU.substack.com. Now, I'm trying to get people to upgrade their subscriptions and get paid subscriptions. I have enough ethics that I wouldn't put my lovely teenage daughter in this video in a bid to encourage people to upgrade, to show what a nice person I am and how I'm deserving and I need a little bit of extra cash to help take care of my life and keep doing this work. But I am shameless enough to show you my daughter's cute puppy, lovely puppy, Bella. Hey, Bella, good doggy. This is such a good dog, such an amazing puppy. She's super, super sweet, super nice. I don't know what this has to do with geopolitics, but I know that she's a super lovely puppy. And if I could get a little bit of cash to help pay for her treats and her training, hey, puppy, 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 good puppy. I love puppies. And if you love puppies too, maybe you should subscribe to Badlands. Get a paid subscription as a gift for anyone in your life who might be interested. Thank you so much. And so here are those interviews played back to back. Again, this is a somewhat less ambitious episode. It is the dog days of summer, and I just got through really one of the hottest periods in Europe in some years. It was just sweltering here, and now the weather is cooling down a little bit. I want to spend some time outside, and I hope you are spending some time outside and enjoying your summer as well.
Iran's newly appointed Revolutionary Guard commander says Tehran has brought the US military to its knees, quote unquote. How should we interpret this statement, do you think? As a genuine assessment of Iran's military performance, or primarily as a messaging to its domestic audiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of bluster in that statement. This is pretty typical for the Revolutionary Guard, especially this generation of the Revolutionary Guard. Did Iran bring the US to its knees? Not really. It could be argued that strategically the United States was outclassed by the Iranians, who were studying this conflict for decades and had been preparing for a possible war like this against the United States for many, many years. They have think tanks and other institutions around the military and around the political and national security apparatuses devoted to discussing this potential conflict with the United States. Meanwhile, Donald Trump basically listening to his pal Benjamin Netanyahu enter this conflict on a whim. And as we see, the United States was not prepared. It does not have enough interceptors to defend itself and its allies. And it doesn't even seem to have enough offensive weapons in terms of the Tomahawk missiles and other advanced munitions with precision technology to continue this conflict. So I think that there is an argument to be made that the United States is losing the conflict, at least strategically. But did they bring the United States to its knees? Absolutely not. The U.S. still has a lot of wherewithal left. And I think that you can't assess this statement as to whether it's factual or non-factual. It's just a political, dogmatic propaganda statement.
The United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operation has received a report confirming that a bulk carrier was struck by an unknown projectile. Officials state that the projectile directly hit the hull of the ship as it was transiting through the waterway. Fortunately, all crew members on board the carrier have been reported safe following the strike. How significant is this incident for safety of international shipping, first of all, but for these crews on board through one of the world's most important waterways? We have spoke in so much detail about the Strait of Hormuz, and it's now all crew members are reportedly safe, but the source of the projectile is still unknown.
This is pretty significant, but I think it's happening really regularly. And most of the attacks are being launched by Iran. There is this channel that the Americans are using to get ships out of the Persian Gulf. They're hugging the Omani coastline and turning off their trackers, moving the oil and other supplies potentially. I'm not sure what this bulk carrier was carrying, whether it was some kind of crucial mineral or just an empty carrier. Not sure of that. And the Iranians say, no, you can't transit through this southern route that hugs the Omani coast. You have to come through the Iranian route in the northern part of the Strait of Hormuz. And so they've been attacking these ships. Each one of these attacks raises insurance costs, raises the peril for the ships that are transiting the Strait of Hormuz, and makes them think twice about doing so. Now, I think what's interesting is that the Iranians aren't doing this systematically. They're not attacking every single ship. And there is some question as to why they're not attacking more aggressively. And one explanation, one pretty well-informed hypothesis, is that they want to keep it at a low simmer. They don't want to go too overboard for fear of alienating allies such as China, for fear of further alienating the Persian Gulf countries, including the United Arab Emirates, which has been rumored to hand over billions of dollars to the Iranians in their own frozen assets as part of a secret deal that will prevent the Iranians from attacking the UAE any further than it already has. And so there is some speculation that they're not attacking every ship that tries to pass through this route that they don't authorize, but they are trying to keep some level of chaos and uncertainty to keep costs up.
Donald Trump has endorsed Bruce Blakeman while launching a fresh attack on Kathy Hochul. Now, how important could Trump's personal involvement be in shaping the Republican campaign in a traditionally Democratic New York?
Well, I mean, New York is complicated because you have the downstate, the New York City area, the tri-state area, which is very, very Democratic, and then the upstate area, which in some ways is more like the U.S. South in terms of its politics when you talk about some of the more rural areas. And I think that perhaps Donald Trump sees a vulnerability in Kathy Hochul's campaign. Apparently, the polls have been tightening in recent days, and he sees an opportunity. Now, why would he care? Why would he care about New York State at all? It's because he has a lot of business dealings there. And although the New York State government doesn't really impact the federal government, he does have his personal interest. He is a New York kid himself. But also, he's gotten a lot of trouble from New York State in terms of his legal problems and his corruption. His various business dealings have come under scrutiny by various New York State governments, even if the federal government is under his control. And I think that perhaps knowing Donald Trump and knowing that everything that he does is about Donald Trump, perhaps his interest, his sudden interest in this particular race has more to do with protecting himself legally and getting control perhaps of New York State, perhaps getting control of some of the mechanisms of state in New York for his preferred candidate, rather than anything having to do with the Congress and the federal government and overall expenditures and so on. And that's where his energies probably should be, with the midterms focusing on the Senate and the Congress and not this little gubernatorial race.
What can you tell us about these recent happenings, and how significant is this agreement between Iran and Oman?
Well, we're still not sure what the agreement is and whether it has been finalized. You have the Iranian word that it has or is approaching finalization. This has happened before. Look, I think that the bottom line is that the U.S. launched this war, and as a kind of marker of just how strategically disastrous it has been for the United States, Iran took this opportunity to seize the Strait of Hormuz, to seize this strategic waterway, as it has said that it would do in the past. And as another sign of the bad position that the U.S. is in, much of the world blames the U.S. for this. And perhaps rightly so. They launched this war, and so they blame the U.S. for this situation in the Strait of Hormuz. So Iran is going to milk it. They're going to seize what they see as the spoils of this war because the U.S. failed to meet any of its objectives, and consolidate their control over this key choke point. And the Omanis, too, are somewhat innocent bystanders in all this. They're being dragged along. They're forced to deal with the Iranians and deal with their attempt to seize control over the Strait of Hormuz. And so that's the situation we are in. This is all a result of a poorly planned out war on the part of the U.S. and its inability to meet any of its goals in that conflict.
Iranian Army Chief Major General Amir Hatami has launched a fiery verbal assault against U.S. President Donald Trump, delivering a direct threat over control of the Strait of Hormuz. Speaking to state media, Hatami has responded to recent comments made by President Trump, who suggested the United States could turn the strategic waterway into American territory. Hatami has dismissed those claims, warning that joking about taking the strait is a major mistake. In a blunt warning, the general has said that Iran is defended and it has people who will break his legs should he try something. The Iranian army commander has claimed that U.S. forces have already been effectively driven out of the region. He has warned that Washington will no longer be permitted to deploy forces into the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, or the Strait of Hormuz, declaring that Iran will never allow American military bases to return to their previous posture. What do you tell us about this recent, I would say, fiery backs from the Iranian side.
This follows Donald Trump's somewhat joking statement on Friday, in which he he claimed, hey, maybe we're going to take the strait for ourselves. We're going to turn it into American territory. And he quickly sort of indicated that he was joking about that. But in any case, the Iranians didn't read it that way. They view his comments as part of the escalation. Whenever the Americans escalate, the Iranians try to increase the escalation. This is what is happening in this conflict. The Iranians are not bowing down to the Americans. If the Americans do something, they try to do worse. They try to outdo them. And that's what this statement essentially is. It's a lot of bluster, breaking Donald Trump's legs. Does he mean that literally? Does he mean that metaphorically about reducing America's ability to act in the Persian Gulf region? I think this is also somewhat dangerous talk to speak in this way, especially when there's accusations and counter accusations of attempts to assassinate Donald Trump. All of this talk is a really dangerous level of escalation, and the rhetoric is getting pretty heated on both sides. That's not very good. These countries should act like adults and negotiate their differences diplomatically instead of making boasts and issuing bluster in the public space.
You mentioned about negotiations, which is part of, I would say, we have heard from both sides what they both want out of this war. Iran has made its claims of what it wants, and so has the US. Do you think there is any chance of these negotiations actually coming to a truce? Because one of the negotiations was that Iran wants reparations for the war, but also the US is also stating the same thing, that it also wants reparation for the war. Are we to see any peaceful advancements on this war, the end to this war?
Well, I mean, eventually the war will end. All wars do. The question is, will that take a few weeks, a few months, or a few years even? And it looks like we're heading towards a more protracted conflict, on and off kinetic warfare, followed by rounds of diplomacy, followed by this kind of escalatory talk on the part of both countries. The Iranians have made their red lines clear and what they've wanted very clear. It's really the U.S. that keeps changing its goals for this conflict. At first, it was regime change. Then it was making sure that Iran never gets any nuclear power. Then it was about reducing Iran's ability to project its power via militias or missiles. And now it's just about returning things to the status quo ante, to the time when the Strait of Hormuz was an international waterway. And the Iranians are just having none of that. Their goal is very clear. They want to destroy Donald Trump. And they've said that repeatedly. You had the general say that essentially. They want to make sure that America, not in the next few months, not in the next few years, not in the next few decades, ever contemplates a war like this again. And the way they hope to achieve that kind of deterrence is by making this very, very painful for the Americans and for the White House.
Let's talk a little about the Strait of Hormuz. Could we say that this is one of the biggest bargaining chips that Iran has?
I mean, it's become more than just a bargaining chip. I think it's become a kind of fait accompli, at least the way the Iranians see it. They took over this Strait of Hormuz at a time of crisis. They claim now that they have a legitimate security concern with regard to the Strait of Hormuz, in that the U.S. used the Strait of Hormuz to bring weapons into the Persian Gulf that were used against Iran. And guess what? A lot of the world kind of sympathizes with them, and they know this. If Iran had just gone in and taken the Strait of Hormuz on any other day of the week, the whole world would have banded together to get them to stop. But because they did it in the context of this war, they now control this strategic choke point, and only the U.S. and Israel are really against it. Of course, the Gulf states are opposed to it as well, and they have an interest, but they're kind of a different category because they're part of the negotiations as to what's going to come next for the Strait of Hormuz. So I think it's even a little bit more than a bargaining chip. It's almost like a spoil of war, at least the way Iran sees it.
All right. We've understood that there are different domains, or rather elements to this war. It's information, diplomatic, and military, right? So understanding these, could you help provide some insight to how Iran is actually winning, and if so, what areas, and the United States as well, depending on these areas?
Well, I think that basically just strategically, the United States had got a bit outclassed here. You have the Iranians, they've been thinking about this war, fearful of this war, preparing for this war for decades, really. And in this particular case, the paranoid, extreme nature of the regime and its sort of militarism worked to its advantage. This is something that many of the people in the human rights community, in the international law community have been very critical about Iran. Its militarism, its paranoia, its treatment of dissidents and so on. And in this particular case, it might have helped them prepare. Meanwhile, you have Donald Trump. Was not prepared. Even the U.S. military is telling him that they're not prepared for a protracted conflict. They have run out nearly of the interceptors and defensive weapons and weapons batteries. And they also seem to be short of some crucial offensive weapons as well, in terms of the precision weapons that the U.S. has gotten addicted to since the first 1991 Gulf War.
All right. So, we've heard talks about compensation. U.S. wants compensations. Iran wants compensations. So this is going to be another bone of contention for resolution of this conflict. What would your perception be on this?
Well, I think that particular issue, the compensation one, is just one where there's a lot of bargaining going on. It's just a way of setting up on each side maximalist demands only to come down later on them, say, hey, we gave in on your demand or our demand for compensation. You can give us this. It's part of the horse trading process. It's not one of the core issues. The core issues are the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's nuclear program, its support for militia groups and proxies around the region, and its missile and drone program. Those are the core issues of contention. As for the issue of compensation, Iran will argue that it's going to get compensation one way or another, either through U.S. reparations or through tolls or fees charged through Strait of Hormuz transit.
All right, looking at the United States and Iran individually, what would be the biggest risk of miscalculation for each?
I think just a long, protracted war. I think for the U.S., of course, the big risk of an expectation in which Iran responds in an unexpected, or rather in an intolerable way, for example, by hitting oil energy infrastructure and gas energy infrastructure in the Persian Gulf, on the Arabian Peninsula, essentially crashing the world economy and creating a situation in which the world economy will not be able to recover for 5 to 15 years. That would be a miscalculation. And for Iran, just getting a little bit too arrogant with its demands, that what I talked about earlier, the sympathy that it has from much of the world right now could dissipate if it's seen as too maximalist, too belligerent, and you could see a more broad coalition other than United States and Israel coming together to combat Iranian ambitions and Iranian presence in the Strait of Hormuz.
So what would a realistic off-ramp look like for this conflict?
Honestly, and I say this someone as an American, the United States should just leave. They should just pack up and go and say, look, have the little bit of humility and grace and say, look, we're just going to focus our attention elsewhere. We have Venezuela to worry about. We have the Caribbean to worry about. We have Asia to worry about. And this situation with Iran, we're going to let it go on its own. And what would happen in that particular case is you would have that situation where the Gulf countries and other countries, including like India and Pakistan, would be like, hey, okay, now the Americans are gone. Now you have to be a little bit more flexible. Now you have to allow free passage through the Strait of Hormuz. That sympathy that the Iranians get from being in this conflict with the U.S. would slowly dissipate and make Iran act in a more normal manner.
All right. So coming back to the Strait of Hormuz, specifically in that location, in that vicinity, in that area, I want to know if U.S. aircraft carriers are still present in the long-term situation. How would that be looking like for the soldiers itself? Because we just saw USS Abraham Lincoln that was on sea for about 200 days. We've heard a great deal of mental health issues and laboratory issues, food insecurity on the ship. How is this going to be playing out for the American soldiers then?
Look, two things. First of all, there have always been U.S. military assets, U.S. naval assets in this area of operations. Right now, they're in the Arabian Sea. Before they were in the Persian Gulf. And I'm saying for decades, there's always been a U.S. military presence, including the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain and other U.S. bases. And there's always been a naval contingent to wherever the Americans are doing in that part of the world. The second point is that, like I said earlier, Americans were not prepared for this conflict. They did not build up for it. Donald Trump was convinced by Benjamin Netanyahu that this would be a cakewalk. It would be over in 4 days, maybe a couple weeks, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks maximum. And instead, it is turned into something of a nightmare for the U.S., in which it is stuck in this escalation cycle with this country that is perhaps even more extreme than Donald Trump is, that whenever Donald Trump says, okay, here's a gun, I'm going to shoot you, I'm going to shoot you, the Iranians say, here's our gun, we're going to shoot you. And so they're not prepared for this. They're not prepared militarily. They didn't build up enough troops. They didn't prepare the American public for a long extended conflict with Iran. So they're in a bind as well. And so those are the two issues. These ships have been coming and going for a long time, but because they were not ready for this long of a conflict, this particular ship and a few other ships have just been stuck doing more than they usually do.
Look, we've also heard talks about Oman and Tehran trying to create an agreement on the Strait of Hormuz. As that being said, what kind of influence would the United States of America have on that?
Well, I think they could put a lot of pressure on the Omanis, and they have, and I'm sure they're not necessarily on the sidelines of the talks, but they're listening in. They're getting briefed by the Omanis. I'm sure the U.S. Embassy in Muscat, the capital of Oman, is a very busy place these days with the Omani officials briefing their American counterparts. So yeah, they could have quite a bit of influence, and in the end, they could probably have veto influence. They could tell the Omanis, you cannot say yes to this, or there will be punishment. There will be consequences for you. And also, I would say that the other Gulf countries have influence over Oman. They are all part of the Gulf Cooperation Council. That organization, that body, is not as unified as it used to be some years ago. It's gone more fragmented, with the Gulf countries each doing their own thing, so to speak, but it still has a significant influence, and the United Arab Emirates and especially Saudi Arabia could also veto any agreement that the Iranians and the Omanis come up with.
All right, coming back to the United States, how are we seeing the midterm elections, especially given the situation? What is the reaction of the public actually going to be like?
Well, I mean, the U.S. public, it looks like there's going to be a dramatic sweep against the Republicans. There's a lot of anger against the Republicans. There's not necessarily about the war, but the consequences of the war. That includes higher prices. Donald Trump came to power in 2024 on a platform of reducing inflation and getting rid of some certain aspects of the government that people didn't like, and including these wars that keep happening over and over again. And he's fallen into both traps. Prices are rising in the U.S. You know, I was just in the U.S. for a month, and wow, you go to the supermarket and the prices are a little bit absurd, a little bit unreasonable compared to what they were even a year earlier when I was there. And so it's gotten very expensive just for ordinary people. And I'm talking like groceries, not like luxury goods and stuff. I'm talking like milk and breakfast cereal, really expensive, really painful on the people who are on fixed incomes or have low incomes. Meanwhile, this crisis in the Gulf keeps bringing up the price of gas, keeping it above $4 a barrel. So, okay, it's legit that people in the rest of the world look at $4 a barrel, $4 a gallon, $1 or so a liter, and say, wait, what's the big deal? That sounds pretty cheap. But for the United States, which is an oil exporting country and also doesn't have the public transportation infrastructure or culture that other countries do, oil and gas have to stay kind of low in order for people to survive, to get to work, to get their kids to school, and so on.
All right, you mentioned oil. Could we see even greater prices when it comes to per barrel?
Yeah, I think we could. And I think that here's the thing. I think that for now, the Iranians are kind of holding their fire with regard to the Strait of Hormuz. They're only attacking ships occasionally as they transit in and out of the Persian Gulf. But that could change potentially once those elections come closer. Then you'll see the Iranians perhaps hitting every ship that transits through the Persian Gulf, through this American-backed Omani channel that hugs the southern coast of the Strait of Hormuz. And in that situation, that could be a real crisis for the Americans. The Iranians could try to bring oil higher and higher just by hitting at the Persian Gulf ships even more than they already do. And that could be something that they're holding back on until those elections approach in early November. Hey, thanks again for watching or listening to Badlands. I'm Borzu Deragahi. You can subscribe to Badlands at Substack. It's at borzu.substack.com. I'm also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on YouTube.